At dawn, before the first reports ever reached the mainland, the island looked almost unreal, as if the ocean itself had pushed up a piece of blackened earth just to remind the world that not every battlefield can be understood from a distance. And long before cameras captured anything recognizable, the air over Iwo Jima carried a silence that felt heavier than sound itself. A silence that would later be replaced by headlines, films, and simplified stories that never truly explained what people were stepping into. Most viewers decades later would come to know this place through carefully framed images, through reenactments, and cinematic moments designed to make sense of chaos. But what they never saw was the slow unraveling of expectations before anything even began. The moment when arriving forces realized that the ground beneath them did not behave like normal terrain, that movement itself felt uncertain, and that every assumption brought from training or briefing began to break apart almost immediately. The official story would eventually become clean and structured, divided into phases and maps and dates. But in the first hours and days, there was nothing structured about it at all, only confusion layered over anticipation, and anticipation layered over a growing awareness that this was not going to resemble anything that had been shown in recruitment films or wartime newsreels. What made Iwo Jima so different was not a single dramatic moment, but the way it forced everyone involved to question the reliability of what they thought they knew about modern warfare. Because the island had been transformed long before anyone arrived into something far more complex than a simple defensive position, a place where visibility, movement, and even sound behaved differently than expected. And while later retellings would focus on symbolic moments and simplified narratives, the early reality was defined by uncertainty, by the absence of clear reference points, and by the gradual realization that this was not a battlefield that could be understood from the outside looking in. For those studying it today, the most important detail is not just what happened there, but what was misunderstood about it for so long. Because even the most famous depictions only captured fragments of a much larger and more disorienting reality. And that gap between perception and truth is exactly where the real story begins. A story that was never fully captured on film, and one that still raises questions about how many other moments in history have been similarly simplified, reshaped, or softened over time, leaving behind only partial truths that feel complete until you start looking closer. The island itself was already shaping the outcome long before any large-scale engagement began, not through dramatic events, but through a slow and almost invisible transformation of geography into something unfamiliar to the human mind, where distances felt shorter than they actually were, and cover that should have been reliable offered no real certainty. From the perspective of those approaching it, what mattered most was not a single moment of confrontation, but the gradual recognition that this terrain had been prepared in ways that defied standard military assumptions, forcing even experienced personnel to reconsider how movement, timing, and coordination would function under such conditions. Reports and briefings attempted to describe it in practical terms, using maps and estimates. Yet those documents could not fully translate the reality of a place that had been reshaped into a layered environment of concealment and depth rather than surface visibility. The expectation going in was that any fortified position could be analyzed, segmented, and eventually reduced through conventional planning. But as the situation developed, it became clear that the structure of defense here did not rely on visible lines at all, instead extending downward and inward in ways that made observation incomplete from the start. This created an environment where even basic situational awareness became a challenge, as standard indicators of movement and positioning were no longer reliable, and every assumption had to be constantly reevaluated in real time. What added to the complexity was the psychological effect of entering a space where silence and activity could shift without warning, making it difficult to distinguish between inactivity and concealment, and this uncertainty began to influence decision-making at every level. Instead of a predictable sequence of engagement, what emerged was a fragmented experience where coordination depended heavily on limited information, often arriving too late to fully inform immediate action. As time progressed, the sense of control that typically defines structured operations began to erode, replaced by a continuous need to adapt to conditions that did not remain consistent long enough to be fully understood. This was not the kind of environment that could be summarized through simple descriptions or traditional analysis, because each layer of terrain and construction seemed designed to challenge perception itself rather than just resist movement. Even communication became more complex as distance and obstruction interfered with clarity, adding further strain to an already unstable situation. In hindsight, what defined this stage was not a single decisive moment, but the accumulation of small uncertainties that gradually reshaped how the entire operation would unfold, setting the foundation for a reality that would continue to diverge from simplified accounts long after the events themselves had ended, leaving behind questions about how much of what was expected at the beginning was ever truly possible in the first place. The further into the situation things progressed, the more it became clear that what was unfolding could not be understood through isolated events or individual actions, but only through the way each moment influenced the next, creating a chain of conditions that steadily reduced the margin for predictability. What had initially been perceived as a structured environment gradually revealed itself as something far more fragmented, where timing was inconsistent and spatial awareness could no longer be relied upon in the conventional sense. This created a situation in which decision-making was continuously adjusted rather than firmly established, with each new piece of information arriving in a form that required immediate reinterpretation rather than confirmation. In such conditions, even experienced personnel found themselves relying less on expectation and more on observation, as prior assumptions began to lose relevance against the reality unfolding in real time. The environment itself contributed to this instability, not as an active force, but as a persistent variable that altered perception in subtle yet significant ways, making it difficult to distinguish between what was permanent and what was temporary within the operational space. Over time, this led to a shift in how the entire situation was mentally processed, moving away from structured planning and toward continuous adaptation, where responses were shaped more by immediate context than by predefined strategy. Communication, which normally serves as the backbone of coordination, became increasingly dependent on fragmented updates, often delayed or incomplete, which further complicated the ability to form a coherent overall picture. As a result, what might have been expected to develop in a linear and manageable progression instead unfolded in a more irregular pattern, where clarity had to be constantly reconstructed rather than assumed. This constant need for reassessment placed a significant cognitive burden on those involved, as the absence of stable reference points meant that even routine actions required additional layers of verification. In retrospect, what defines this stage of the situation is not a single turning point or dramatic shift, but rather the gradual accumulation of uncertainty, where each layer of complexity reinforced the next, creating an environment in which understanding itself became an ongoing process rather than a fixed state, and where the expectation of control gave way to the reality of continuous adaptation under conditions that did not remain constant long enough to be fully resolved. As the situation continued to unfold, what had once been perceived as a series of isolated developments began to merge into a broader pattern that was no longer easy to separate into clear stages or defined phases, and this gradual convergence created a sense that the environment itself was evolving faster than any single response could fully account for. The earlier expectation that conditions would eventually stabilize or return to a predictable structure was steadily replaced by the realization that instability had become the defining characteristic of the entire setting, influencing not only immediate perception, but also the way information was processed and interpreted over time. In this context, even small changes in position or timing carried disproportionate significance because they could alter the overall understanding of the situation in ways that were not immediately visible. As a result, the mental framework used to interpret events began to shift from one based on fixed reference points to one that relied heavily on continuous reassessment, where each new input had to be evaluated in relation to a constantly changing baseline. This created a condition in which certainty became increasingly difficult to maintain, not because of a lack of information, but because of the sheer volume of variables interacting simultaneously without clear boundaries. The environment reinforced this effect by refusing to present itself in a consistent or easily categorized form, instead revealing different aspects of itself depending on perspective, timing, and proximity, which made any attempt at forming a stable overview inherently incomplete. Over time, this led to a deeper recognition that what was being experienced could not be reduced to a simple sequence of events, but instead represented a layered and continuously shifting system in which each element influenced the others in unpredictable ways. Within such a framework, the concept of control itself became more abstract, less tied to direct action and more dependent on the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions without relying on assumptions that no longer held consistent value. This ongoing adaptation required constant mental recalibration, as previous understanding had to be revised repeatedly in order to remain relevant to the current state of affairs. In the absence of stable reference points, even familiar patterns began to lose their reliability, forcing a reevaluation of how information was prioritized and how decisions were formed under pressure. What emerges from this stage is not a singular moment of change, but a continuous process of adjustment in which stability is never fully reached and where understanding is always provisional, shaped by conditions that evolve faster than they can be fully defined or contained. At this stage of the unfolding situation, the focus shifts away from the expectation of structured engagement and moves into a sustained condition where adaptation becomes the only consistent requirement, and every attempt to impose order must first pass through layers of uncertainty that continue to reshape themselves without clear warning. What was once interpreted as a manageable sequence of developments now presents itself as a continuous flow of interdependent conditions, where no single element can be fully understood in isolation from the others. This creates a working environment in which perception is constantly challenged by the absence of stable reference points, forcing an ongoing recalibration of how information is interpreted and prioritized. Rather than operating within a predictable framework, the process becomes one of continuous reassessment, where each new observation must be integrated into a shifting mental model that rarely remains consistent long enough to be considered final. Over time, this results in a gradual erosion of confidence in fixed assumptions, not because information is lacking, but because the relationships between data points are no longer stable or linear. The environment reinforces this instability by presenting conditions that vary in intensity and clarity depending on proximity and timing, making it increasingly difficult to establish a unified understanding of the overall situation. As a result, even routine evaluations require additional layers of analysis, as previously reliable indicators begin to lose their consistency under changing circumstances. This forces a transition from structured interpretation to adaptive reasoning, where conclusions are formed temporarily and revised as new information emerges. Within this framework, the concept of a definitive outcome becomes less relevant than the process of continuous adjustment, where understanding is always in motion rather than fixed in place. Each development does not resolve the uncertainty, but instead contributes to a broader accumulation of complexity, reinforcing the need for constant reassessment. In this way, the situation evolves into something that is not defined by singular moments of change, but by the sustained pressure of variability itself, where stability is never fully achieved and clarity must be repeatedly reconstructed rather than assumed. As the situation continued to evolve, the operational environment reached a point where traditional expectations of progression no longer applied in any meaningful way, and what had once been thought of as a structured sequence of actions now existed as a prolonged state of continuous strain on perception, timing, and coordination. The conditions did not present themselves as a single identifiable challenge, but instead as an overlapping set of pressures that affected every level of understanding simultaneously, forcing constant adjustment without the benefit of stable reference points. At this stage, the distinction between planning and execution became increasingly blurred, as each decision had to be made within an environment that was itself changing faster than it could be fully assessed. What made this phase particularly significant was not the presence of any single defining moment, but rather the accumulation of minor disruptions that gradually reshaped the overall coherence of the situation. Information flow became irregular and often incomplete, requiring interpretation to fill in gaps that could not be verified in real time, which in turn increased the cognitive complexity of every subsequent evaluation. As a result, the ability to maintain a consistent operational picture depended less on fixed analysis and more on continuous recalibration, where understanding was constantly being rebuilt rather than preserved. The environment reinforced this instability by offering limited visibility into outcomes, meaning that cause and effect relationships could not always be clearly established at the moment they occurred. Instead, meaning had to be inferred retroactively, often after conditions had already shifted into a new configuration. This created a layered perception of reality, where each new development did not resolve uncertainty, but instead added another dimension to it, making the overall system increasingly difficult to simplify or summarize. Within this framework, coordination became a process of managing uncertainty rather than eliminating it, with each adjustment designed not to achieve final resolution, but to maintain functional continuity under changing conditions. Over time, this approach became the only viable method of engagement, as attempts to impose rigid structure consistently failed to account for the variability of the environment. What emerged from this stage was a clear shift away from expectation of control and toward acceptance of ongoing adaptation, where stability was no longer treated as an achievable endpoint, but as a temporary condition that required constant reinforcement. In this way, the situation continued to develop, not through singular breakthroughs or defined turning points, but through the persistent and cumulative effect of instability itself, shaping every aspect of interpretation and response in a way that resisted simplification. As the situation progressed beyond the stage of continuous adaptation, a new layer of structural change began to emerge, not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual weakening of the underlying coherence that had previously held the system together. And this weakening did not present itself in a single identifiable moment, but rather through a series of subtle shifts that altered how information, movement, and interpretation interacted across the entire environment. What had once been a complex but still partially readable system of conditions now began to lose internal consistency, as the relationships between cause and effect became less reliable and more dependent on timing that could no longer be predicted with any degree of confidence. This shift did not eliminate activity or engagement, but it changed the way those elements functioned, reducing the effectiveness of structured responses and increasing reliance on immediate, localized interpretation rather than broader, coordinated understanding. As a result, the environment transitioned into a phase where previously established frameworks of assessment no longer provided stable guidance, forcing a reevaluation of how decisions were formed under conditions where feedback was delayed, fragmented, or incomplete. Within this evolving structure, the concept of a unified operational picture became increasingly difficult to maintain, as each new input introduced additional variables that could not be fully integrated into existing models before those models themselves began to lose relevance. This created a cascading effect in which partial understanding replaced comprehensive clarity, and each attempt to stabilize interpretation required greater effort while producing diminishing returns in terms of accuracy or reliability. Over time, the accumulation of these inconsistencies began to reshape the overall perception of the situation, making it clear that the environment was no longer operating within the boundaries of its earlier defined structure, but had instead entered a phase characterized by persistent fragmentation and reduced predictability. In this phase, even well-established patterns of behavior and response began to lose their effectiveness, not because they were incorrect in principle, but because the conditions under which they had previously functioned no longer existed in a stable form. This forced a shift toward continuous recalibration, where understanding had to be reconstructed repeatedly as new information emerged, often invalidating earlier assessments before they could be fully acted upon. The result was a sustained state of interpretive instability, where clarity existed only in short intervals and required constant reinforcement to remain usable. As this process continued, the distinction between structured analysis and reactive adjustment began to dissolve, creating a working environment defined not by control or predictability, but by the necessity of operating within an ongoing cycle of uncertainty that could not be resolved through conventional means, and which continued to redefine the limits of what could be reliably understood at any given moment. As the situation moved into its final phase of structural culmination, What had previously been experienced as a continuous cycle of instability and adaptive interpretation began to converge into a broader condition where uncertainty no longer appeared as a series of fluctuating variables, but instead as a sustained state that defined the entire operational reality from within. At this point, the system no longer presented any meaningful distinction between short-term variation and long-term pattern, because both had effectively merged into a single continuous field of unresolved conditions that could only be understood in fragments. The earlier expectation that increased observation or extended analysis would eventually produce clarity had already been replaced by a more constrained reality in which additional information no longer reduced ambiguity, but instead reinforced the complexity of interpretation. As a result, the framework for understanding the situation shifted once again, moving away from attempts to reconstruct coherence and toward an acceptance that coherence itself was no longer a stable or achievable reference point. Within this environment, every component of assessment began to operate under the assumption that outcomes could not be fully predicted in advance, and that even the most carefully constructed models would remain provisional by necessity rather than exception. This created a condition in which evaluation became less about reaching conclusions and more about maintaining functional awareness within a system that resisted final definition. Over time, the accumulation of unresolved variables produced a perceptual environment in which clarity was no longer absent in a traditional sense, but instead existed in intermittent and partial forms that could not be sustained long enough to form a complete picture. This intermittent clarity required constant recalibration, as each moment of understanding was quickly overtaken by new conditions that altered its relevance. In this way, the entire structure of interpretation became increasingly self-correcting, not because it was moving toward accuracy, but because it was continuously adapting to the absence of stable reference points. The significance of this stage lies not in any singular transformation, but in the realization that the system had effectively transitioned into a state where instability was no longer an external influence acting upon it, but an internal condition defining how all elements interacted with one another. This meant that even attempts to impose structure or retrieve earlier patterns of understanding were filtered through a reality that no longer supported those earlier frameworks. Consequently, the experience of the situation became one of persistent recalibration, where each new input was evaluated not against a fixed standard, but against a constantly shifting baseline that prevented final resolution. What ultimately emerged from this phase was not closure in the traditional sense, but a recognition that the entire process had evolved into a continuous state of interpretive motion, where understanding existed only as long as it was actively maintained, and where the absence of stability had become the defining characteristic of the system itself. At this final stage of the unfolding process, what remains is not a continuation of earlier uncertainty, but a complete internalization of it, where instability is no longer experienced as a condition acting upon the system, but as the fundamental structure through which all perception and interpretation must now operate. The distinction between earlier phases and present reality has effectively dissolved, not through resolution, but through accumulation, until there is no longer a meaningful separation between analysis, adaptation, and awareness itself. Every attempt to reconstruct a coherent sequence of understanding is now filtered through a framework that no longer supports stable reference points, meaning that even retrospective interpretation becomes subject to the same shifting conditions that define present perception. In this environment, clarity does not disappear entirely, but it ceases to function as a permanent state, instead appearing only in brief and fragmented intervals that cannot be sustained long enough to form a complete or unified conclusion. As these intervals become less predictable, the act of interpretation itself transforms into a continuous process of recalibration, where each new moment must be assessed independently while simultaneously accounting for variables that remain in constant motion. This creates a cognitive structure in which finality is no longer a reachable endpoint, but an abstract concept that exists only as a reference rather than an achievable condition. Over time, this sustained absence of resolution begins to define the entire framework of understanding, replacing earlier expectations of structure with a more fluid and unstable model of awareness that cannot be fully stabilized through conventional means. The significance of this transformation lies not in any single development, but in the realization that the system has transitioned beyond the point where external correction or additional information can restore coherence, because the conditions that once supported coherence no longer exist in a consistent form. What remains is a persistent state of interpretive motion, where meaning is continuously formed and reformed without settling into permanence, and where each attempt to establish clarity inevitably reveals new layers of complexity that prevent closure. In this sense, the situation does not conclude in the traditional way, but instead continues as an unresolved continuum, where understanding is always incomplete, and every perceived answer carries within it the structure of further uncertainty, leaving behind a lingering sense that what has been observed is only a fraction of something that remains fundamentally unfinished.